Hello, everyone, and welcome to CFL Talk. I'm Candid, Frank Stanisci of CFL Talk. Welcome to the Spanglish World Network on Zingo TV, channel 250. Please remember to download the Zingo TV app at the respective app stores for iOS and Android devices. While you download the app, make sure you rate and leave a comment. Both apps are absolutely free. Zingo TV is available on Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire TV sticks, Roku sticks, and also on all smart TVs 2016 forward. Now on CFL Talk, joining me is the one, the only, Dwayne Ford. And in the background, recovering from COVID-19, David Morassutti. The prayers are working, David. You're doing fine.
I felt the prayers. I felt all the love the last week and a half since I got my positive diagnosis. So I really appreciate all the support from everyone throughout this.
Yes, we keep sending our love to everyone who catches that horrible virus and the people who recover. And it's a long road back. David's here. Let's just say he's in the bullpen. He is going to contribute to the extent that he's comfortable. This is all because we care about him and we love having him here. And it's Dwayne Ford's fault that he's here because David Morassutti is a big fan of Dwayne Ford and he wanted to be a part of this. And I can understand why. Mr. Ford, you have been a central person when it comes to the Canadian Football League. You understand mentorship, representation. You obviously are a former player. You played for 12 years. If I can do this as your life for a moment. You played 91-92 at the Calgary Stampeders. You won a Grey Cup. In 93, you played for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. In 94-95, you played for the Toronto Argonauts. In 96-2000, you played for the Calgary Stampeders, and you won the Grey Cup in 98 there. In 2001, 2002, I can't believe this, you actually played for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, but we'll forgive you for that. You were a TSN analyst. You are now a draft expert for the CFL and TSN. You played for the Western Ontario Mustangs, one of the dynasties in college football. You won the 1989 Vanier Cup, twice the Mustangs' most valuable player, and a team that lost only once during the regular season. Now, we'll start by asking you, sports is obviously important to your life. In fact, your better half is involved in sports. So in your home, sports is pretty much stirs the drink in the house to a degree. I'm sure you offset it with other stuff. Tell me a little bit about, your life when it comes to sports and how important it has been to you in your life.
Yeah, I would say that certainly I don't want to say necessarily the importance of sports per se, but certainly the importance of understanding how to be part of a team, the importance of the physical fitness involved, the importance of having extracurricular activities for kids growing up is something that was always instilled in us. My father was a high school principal in Peel Region. Basically, his first year as a principal was the year I was born. So that was basically all I knew growing up. And I would say one of the differences between his time as a principal versus now, where I find that there are probably too many other demands, quite frankly, too many demands placed on principals in schools that they don't probably get as involved with the students as they would like to. I was a guy who always coached sports teams at schools, and he coached my brother and I on teams outside of school in many different sports. So he coached high school football. We would go watch games, obviously. We were a family of Toronto Argonaut season tickets, Toronto Maple Leaf season ticket holders. So those were big things. As I said, my dad coached lots of other things. We played hockey. He coached us on those teams outside school. And again, it wasn't something that was winning or my father trying to push us to a higher level in sports. I think just recognizing the value of young men and women being involved in activities, in being part of a team and learning cooperation, teamwork, leadership, education, all of those great things that come from being involved in sports just inherently in team sports in general. And so those were important in my life growing up. And I guess for me now as a parent are things that I think continue to be very important.
I think two of the most important phrases that when I look at you and when I think of what you've gone through specifically, because I can ask you, but this is a general question when it comes to all kinds of athletes. There's a couple of phrases that come to mind. One is paying it forward, and the other is giving back. Can you speak about that, being where you've been and where you've come from?
Yeah, absolutely. I was always very fortunate, as I said, I mean, to have a role model like my father in my house that, the mentorship was very close at hand. The example was right there. But when you go back, I mean, for me, high school was the 80s, and a little bit different time where I would say that before the necessarily of rep sports to the degree that those community sports rep teams outside of school high school for a lot of people was kind of the highest level, the pinnacle of sport for that age group at that time. And there weren't volunteer community so much at that time. It was teachers who gave their time, whether before the school day, at the end of the school day, to have school teams, to give kids an opportunity to play on those teams. For me at Port Credit Secondary School in Mississauga, that was big, not just in terms of people, co-phys ed teachers who would show up at 7 o'clock in the morning and open up the equipment so we could kind of have a free run, go out basketball and just play pickup, and that were, I think, important to the school community and probably important to a lot of kids, just to have that opportunity for blow off some steam, to have some camaraderie, some exercise, and so on. And for me, as I've grown up, I have time coaching minor hockey teams. I've spent time coaching high school football. I've run high school football camps, and even to the point of running combines prior to the CFL running their regional combines, to provide an opportunity to be scouted who hadn't been invited to the main combine, as the numbers for that were pretty limited. So the paying it forward, I definitely a believer in that it is important. You opportunities without other people giving their time, and it keeps the cycle going, I suppose, if we all just sort of.
It's important because not every home is built like your home was when you were raised. Some kids need a little more outside, if I can use this term, guidance or support. And that's one of the things that sports can provide, correct?
Yeah, and not just in maybe giving kids an opportunity to meet other men and see different styles of leadership than what may go on, but to learn teamwork and things like that, as I mentioned earlier, that I think are pretty important lessons growing up. I think that beyond that, I'm a believer that sports is one of the powerful tools that we have in terms of being able to bring communities together. And the analogies that I use, both big and small scale, I would say something like the Olympics, where it's that one time where everybody on the same page and pulling in the same direction and cheering for the same thing. And you think about it as Canada wins medals in certain sports, honking outside in the neighborhood, and so you've got an entire country being brought together because of the country's success, the country's competition in sporting events. And even on a smaller scale, I think that it applies in the high school setting, that you don't necessarily have to have the most successful teams, but I think having opportunities for sports teams, for fitness programs, things like that, I'm not sure that there are more powerful tools in a school in terms of opportunities to bring people together and to generate pride within that school community.
That's the key, growing up and being an avid. My career in television sports was community sports. Were small s sports, right? The ones that were the lifeblood of the community, in my opinion. One talks about diversity, and one of the things that I learned, and I ask you, diversity and sports go hand in hand, because nothing teaches people the similarities between us and also pulling on that same rope in the same direction than sports for communities that are new in Canada or people of diverse backgrounds. It's a real bringer of togetherness, in my opinion. Your view?
Yeah, I think the same thing. When you look at sports and you look at people on a team, let's use football as an example. You can
Why
have,
not? That's why we're here.
that's it. You know, Canadian football, obviously 12 people on the field, 12 people with very different jobs, but no one person's job is more important than any other over the course of a game, right? If it takes everybody doing their job for a play to be successful, if one person breaks down, the play breaks down. And so understanding the importance of just of other people who may be different from you in that context, and then expanding that to the bigger context in terms of diversity within your community. But going beyond that, that basically you get on a team and it's sort of, again, a group of people who may have differences outside of the context of the sport or outside of the context of the team, but now they have a common goal and they're united, and usually those differences are forgotten. And as you said, those are the things that allow sports to bring people together.
The other thing we learn, and I've witnessed, I played high school sports. I played football and I played intramural hockey, so I was never a star athlete by any stretch. It also teaches you, when you play sports, outside pressure can become irrelevant in the right context. In other words, even when you play pro, because what you were talking about, this question ties into what you were talking about. It's the outside people that come up with ideas that have nothing to do with what happens in the locker room. What you said is 100% true. As far as the team is concerned, no one is more important. And what playing sports, and what I've noticed from professional football players, they always default back to we're a team, no matter how much attention one player gets. For example, no offense, from the media, it's still a team sport, and that's important. That's a great lesson to learn, to ignore some of the noise that happens outside of where you live and who you are.
Yeah, nobody else is going through the same things that the people on the team are going through. And so, at risk of being dismissive, a lot of times their opinions, their viewpoints, their feelings about it are irrelevant. And it's a value, I think, when you are within a team and you have the support of those around you, to be able to shut out typically the negativity coming from the outside, and don't give too much power to people who don't matter.
Yeah, and like, I can prove my ignorance. I learned a couple of weeks ago that football players don't wear cups. See, I didn't even know that. Now, there's lots of reasons why I don't know that. Many of them are just normal. So, our ignorance, even though we cover the sport and cover it very closely, we miss out on a lot of the nuance. And what are some of the things? And I'm not looking for any negative comment about the media. An understanding as a player, and in your history in your life in football, you've run the gamut. You've been everywhere. You've probably turned over every stone there is in as far as your life and the life around you. What are some of the things that you would comment on to help us to understand better and appreciate the game of football, soup to nuts, from youth to pro?
Sorry, just to clarify, you mean just in terms of following the sport, or breaking down?
Well, as following it, and what are some of the misunderstandings? Like, people assume things. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. They assume that football, because it tends to look like a violent sport, people think that football players in general are violent. They make that association when they don't understand that it's actually a game. When the game's over, you can speak to that issue if you like.
Yeah, I mean, to address that specifically, I would say that listen, I'm a guy who loves the physical element of the game of football. There are rules there for a reason, for one thing, and players are becoming better protected. Obviously, protective equipment has always been a big part of the game and something that has constantly evolved as the game has gone along. I think the rules are following, but yeah, it's call it controlled aggression rather than violence, and it is within the context and within the rules of a game that to assume that the people playing the game, just because they like to play a physical game or physical sport, doesn't mean that that they're going to be violent people. You know, I would say obviously one of the other great myths out there would probably have to do with stereotyping the intelligence of football players. And you know, the big dumb jock, the big dumb football player, stereotype to me is something that's always been comical, as I'd invite anybody in to learn, whether at a university level or professional level, to learn the playbook at the rate that players have to learn the playbook, and be able to go out and execute those things, and in a sport where you are constantly having to make decisions in fractions of a second. You know, so I mean, that would be another one, obviously, that I think people don't necessarily see the reality on.
It's sort of like the saying about, you know, golf's not a sport because there's no contact. You know, people don't understand.
Yeah,
that
it
like
takes
a warehouse
ridiculous level of physical skill to play it.
and no, but it does, because you know, football is important to Canadians. You know, why is it important to Canadians?
Well, I think that Canadian football is important to Canadians because it truly is woven into the fabric of the culture of this country. It's something that is unique to our country. You know, when you start talking about Canadian rules, you start talking about the history of the Canadian Football League and the Grey Cup. People have their allegiances that are important to them. That tribalism. You know, whether you are a Saskatchewan Roughriders fan or a Winnipeg Blue Bombers fan, or, you know, come Labor Day when it's Argos versus Tiger Cats and Edmonton versus Calgary, that those rivalries that we talked earlier about, your pride within your community, I think that the sport of football plays certainly a role in that.
Even the fans, you know, because I spent a lot of time with them. I obviously was one. I used to admire your play. Even the fans, you know, the aggression that they have in the stands is not what it's all about, because all one has to do, and I know you've experienced this, you won the Grey Cup twice, you see when the fans get together, there is this community that the Canadian Football League generates. It definitely supports, and it's this idea of community in the Canadian Football League, not only as a league, but as teams as well, that they generate. Speak to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think when you look at the Canadian, obviously there is sort of that regionalized element to it, but as you see over generations, where families move around, people move around probably a little bit more than they did generations ago, where people would sort of always live in the town where they were born, kind of thing. One of the things I love to see is how somebody who maybe was born in Saskatchewan, as an example, and you know, it is the ultimate example of being so much a part of the community, and so much a part of people's up within that community, that you go anywhere across the country and run into someone who is originally from Saskatchewan, wherever they are. They kind of remain a Saskatchewan Roughriders fan and have their share of green in their wardrobe. And if the Riders come to a CFL park anywhere near them, they show their colors. And you know, it is something that isn't just about the game of football, but again, pride in their roots, pride in where they came from, and you're about Canadian football being a part of the idea came from.
There's a good example going on right now about that. I think you were at the press conference for the first overall pick that Hamilton ended up making. He was born in Saskatchewan, raised in Boston, and excited to play in the Canadian Football League. And you could feel the excitement that rubbed off on him, for example, from his grandmother. And you're right. It's basically all one has to do is be open to seeing what the CFL has to offer, and it's amazing how much it gives and how attractive it is to any individual, especially a Canadian from anywhere.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity too for players and fans to enter a little bit. I think the accessibility of the players in this league to fans has been and needs to continue to be one of the selling features of this league. Is, I mean, not the Canadian players are even taking that a step further when you get Canadian players who are very much people that fans can identify in terms of their backgrounds are similar to the fans who are in the stadium watching. And so I think that that's a selling feature. But just in general, I think there is a level of excitement when you talk about differences between the Canadian Football League and the National Football League. Obviously, you have people who are playing not for a chance to get rich, but are football of a sheer love of the game. And I think that that's so often true.
Yeah, we look at the Canadian Football League, and now, because of what you said, as far as the interest in the game, that is the key, because the fans that are in the stands have a direct relationship with the game, which is why, Mr. Ford, it's important that this game, it's not just about the CFL survival, it's about the game survival, because both of them are joined. They're all part of everything, and without one, I don't think you have the other.
Yeah, I think it becomes very difficult if if you see the CFL lose too much of its Canadian ID. I do think it affects the game at other levels in this country. I am obviously a big supporter of the sport, just the sport of football, but very specifically the sport of Canadian football, and take pride in what it is as a Canadian, the uniqueness of it, the history of it, the fact that this is a league that has survived as long as it has. That's not something that you ever want to see go away, or quite frankly, to see the value of it minimum in any way.
Yeah, that to me, that's one of the biggest challenges that we all have. Not just the Canadian Football League, not just Canadian football, not just yourself, but we all have that challenge that we maintain a clear view of what the Canadian Football League means and not be distracted by, unfortunately, some of the people who have a negative attitude towards it. B, people who do things unintentionally, if you will, that create an atmosphere of creating this idea that they're making a negative comment. And surviving this for Canadian Football League fans is difficult. Those are two of the biggest challenges I think we have to deal with.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, in terms of perception, sometimes about the CFL, I laugh, and I am not a guy who often feels a need to kind of give my own resume or background or whatever. I mean, people know enough about who I am, I suppose, and where I've been. But in terms of that background, I will say this: I grew up, as I said, in a family of CFL season ticket holders. That the days 16 games. Toronto Argonauts played 8 home games. I was probably at least 6 of them every year growing up in the days of 40,000+ fans in the stands. I have always been a fan of this league at a level. Obviously, I played in this league for 12 years. And playing in the league too was my last. In the 19 years since that, I have followed the league very closely and have, I mean, I see as many games in person as anyone on the planet every year for the last 13 years. The thing I'll say is that their perception sometimes about the players not as good as the players in National League, as an example. And it's something that always ticked me off, because from the inside, I think we can all acknowledge that when you look at pros in the National Football League, guys in the National League, those are guys who could play anywhere. But I think once you get past the abs guys, quite honestly, the difference between the guys playing in the NFL and the guys playing in the CFL has a specific skill set, style of play, and sometimes I would say even a mindset, far more to do with that than it has to do with an actual skill level of the players. There are plenty of guys on rosters, plenty of guys seeing them in the National Football League who would struggle to be in the CFL because it's a different game. And obviously the same exists of some guys who are Canadian League stars. That doesn't automatically mean that they would be, Cam Baker or Jarrell Freeman or Doug Flutie or Jeff Guy and be sort of Pro Bowl level players if they went to the National Football League. They're different games, but don't mistake that automatic for that meaning that this is a clearly lower skill level. May not have, as I said, those Pro Bowl caliber guys, but in terms of the quality of play, the skill level of the players, it's absolutely remarkable. It is far higher than the casual CFL fan will say, or CFL detractors give it credit for.
In that vein, David, did you want to?
Well, I did want to touch upon that because it really, especially where we live here in Toronto, it really feels like the CFL gets that sort of, the mindset of like they're competing against the the NHL, the NBA, MLB, in terms of like those are the three like the biggest sports in North America, and then the CFL kind of gets lumped in towards that. Do you think that's kind of unfair? A lot of the times you hear like that comparison and people trying to lump the CFL with that in terms of like the talent level and the lack of attendance and all those things.
Yeah, I do think that it's unfair. And again, I think that a lot of it comes from, we talked about shutting out the noise. And, one of the things that I kind of talk about is, if you want to call it media literacy. And I don't just mean in terms of sort of the media industry, but just in general, like in terms of opinions that you see, read, hear, wherever you may see, read, or hear them, is considering the source. And I think that, then, as I alluded to, I think off the criticism that may get at the CFL in terms of the quality of play or the skill level of the players and those sorts of things, I think those are opinions that are usually don't watch the CFL closely and don't analyze this closely. And so not opinions, they're, so that's something that has always been very funny to me, but challenge in Southern Ontario and in Toronto most specific, because when you look at the Blue Jays, the Leafs, the Raptors, they're playing in leagues that are undisputed as the best league in the world in their given sport. And obviously when you look at the Canadian Football League with the existence of the National Football League, people don't say, but I think again, people also have to recognize it's not the exact same game, and it's a lot closer than I think a lot of people give it credit for in the quality of play.
There's a correlation when it comes to quarterbacks, Canadian quarterbacks. Some people suggest there's like this, not discrimination, but this bias for American quarterbacks because the coaches, the majority of them are American, and they have a little more respect for quarterbacks that come through, those programs as opposed to Canadian programs. I prefer to look at it as the problem that they have to overcome, which might be a little more invasive, and that is comfort level, where a coach has a comfort level to coach a player who's been through U.S. colleges and such. Is there any truth to that, or your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, and I think that that's something that exists. I guess the analogy I'll give has to do with recruiting. And so one of the things that we see in terms of kids who are trying to American colleges now, Canadian kids who are trying Division I football. We even basketball a long time ago, but
Absolutely.
One of the factors in terms of why you now see so many kids of the top go and finish school career at American school has to do with the opportunities they get being recruited. And it's not so much about necessarily the level of play, level of competition being so there, but it has to do with the fact that recruiters are familiar with the level of play, the level of competition in the States. And they want to see players play in a with which they're familiar, as opposed to maybe having to project and figure it out in a context that known to them. They don't know how good high school league A in Canada is. So when you see a player being successful in that league, they don't necessarily know what that means. They can't compare it to anything. And so they want to see those kids compete and play against something that they understand. And I think it kind of translates to a CFL level that I'm not sure it's national discrimination per se, but they're getting a little out of context when they're evaluating quarterbacks when they're coming out of school. They are more familiar with the guys who have played college football at the level at which they may have coached, or at the level with which they are more familiar, they're more comfortable, a path that is more tried and true. I mean, as creative, I think, as the Canadian Football League is in a lot of things from a coaching point of view, a strategy point of view, I think the bottom line is when you look a lot of times at player evaluation, the tools that people use, the standards by which people are not things that are quick to change. And that sometimes is the nature of the game, but it's also something that I'd like to see change.
It's also human nature. I'll add familiarity to comfort level. David?
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like when we were talking about, I think it was Nathan Rourke actually recently. I was reading that he's actually practicing as a receiver right now in the NFL, trying to get a shot in the NFL. But everyone talks about him as a Canadian quarterback. I thought it would have been nice to see more Canadian quarterbacks get the spotlight in the position that they grew up playing and wanted to play, and not have to make the transition to a different position in order to make a roster. Do you feel like some Canadians are too quick to kind of adopt a different position, or decide they might not view me as a quarterback because of where I've come from, and maybe I just need to try something different just so I can get myself the opportunity?
Yeah, and I'm certainly not going to blame it on the players who are looking for an opportunity to play and are going to do the thing that the people around them are telling them gives them the best opportunity to play. But that said, I do think sometimes that maybe the development of those players, referring to Canadian quarterbacks specifically, is something that gets abandoned a little too quickly, maybe not recognizing the potential in those players, not giving them the time to adjust from the Canadian university level to the professional game, which is going to be a bigger jump in terms of speed of the game, typically from Canadian university football to pro football, than when you look at American colleges. And also, I think when you look at just things like the level of experience that the players have, the number of reps they've had at the time when they arrive, say in a Canadian Football League training camp, Canadian typically hasn't had nearly the same number of reps, having to do with age, having to do with climate, having to do that his American counterpart would. But one of the points that I make about it is so many of the quarterbacks who are successful in the Canadian football, guys coming out of the big programs, right? They're not the guys coming out of the biggest FBS programs necessarily. So many guys are from smaller schools. You look at guys like Mike Riley, Trevor Harris, who are guys who are at Division II schools in the States. And if you can expand your thinking at that a little bit, you realize that there are also some players at the position who may be playing at Football World, what would be considered small schools, or maybe a lower level of competition in youth sports football. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the potential to be given the opportunity very successful.
Yeah, the potential's the key. One can look. You touched on it a little bit. There's a different experience for Canadians in sports. Recently, one of the best soccer players now is a young player that comes from Canada, and he's playing in England. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. I've lost his name in my head. I had it in there while you were talking. And with basketball players, Canadian basketball players are proving to be just as talented as the Americans because they're given the opportunity. And I think Dwayne, also it is. I covered high school basketball 20 years ago in Toronto. Did play-by-play of their games. The excitement level at those. You're old enough to remember that what I'm talking about. I hope.
Yeah, no
The
question.
excitement level within the gym. You had 1,000, 1,200 kids cheering on the other kids, and it had big league all over it. And I think it's all about, opportunity and the belief system that we create. And you're a big proponent of creating that belief system that Canadians can compete. We know it in basketball. We're seeing it in soccer. And you've always said that possibility is in football. So it's all about opportunity, right? And creating an atmosphere that allows a person, because these are all human beings all over the world. We're all human beings. We all have the ability to achieve greatness. We just need the opportunity and the roadway in front of us that'll get us there.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And a lot of times in Canada, historically, one of the challenges, and I'll relate this to basketball as well, but say in both sports, I would say that part of the challenge historically, in terms of getting players to the highest levels, has been not that you don't have the same sort of percentage of elite athletes, within Canada as you have within the United States. And I say percentage wise because obviously the US has a much greater population. But because of the population, what that means is the competition in Canada historically has been so much more spread out. And so that an athlete of a certain level, whether it's basketball, whether it's football, may be limited in terms of the level of players that he is playing against, the level of to which he is being challenged, the amount of adversity that he has to learn to overcome, and so on. Because, for example, you take a guy who's a Division I caliber offensive tackle in terms of what his size are, what his movement skills are, what his technique is when he's coming out of high school. But I mean, he may go through his entire high school career without facing a defensive end who is of that caliber. And so, in terms of kind of learning mental toughness, learning to overcome adversity, having to be focused and tuned in on every play, because you have to be at your best on every play and things like that. Sometimes those are things that lead to a player not reaching his potential. And so, this is where I talk about sometimes where basketball is the sport that I think laid the roadway, where it wasn't necessarily about guys at that time going down and playing at American schools, but it was about going down and playing in American tournaments, and even within Canada, bringing the best guys together on all-star teams and playing against other all-star teams and those sorts of things, so that it was going beyond what you were getting at the high school level in terms of competition. And what I'd like to see in football is, we're seeing obviously a lot of guys going down to the States to get that level of competition and in high school and prep school experiences and so on. But also, both in high school and even at the Canadian university level, kind of creating maybe more opportunities like the East-West Bowl, for example, that create opportunities for best on best competition, that it's ultimately going to raise the level of competition for all of those players and kind of teach those guys, some of the competition skills, we'll call them, that get them to a higher level.
Sounds like a soapbox to me. You wanna step up on it, or do you?
Well, that,
I promise.
I
promise.
may be as high as I need to step on that particular soapbox, but yeah, I think obviously in terms of the talent that's here, I think it's remarkable, and it's just a matter of, as I said, whether it means competing against people from other areas or bringing people together from distant areas to create that competition, to I'll call it servicing the needs of the top kids. You know, community sports are great, and I support them 100%, obviously. But sometimes in community sports or high school sports, those very top guys maybe need a little bit extra. And sometimes looking at the sport of football, you know, maybe we need to take some steps to create some more of those opportunities. And believe me, it's obviously come a long way with, you know, I wouldn't even say every generation, but every decade. I think that you are seeing more and more people, more and more groups, organizations stepping up to create some of those, and we just want to make sure that it continues.
We have that already in Canada. There's proof of it if you go to Saskatchewan. You see the level of play there, and the activity and the challenges that each player up against at a higher level. We see it in BC. We see it, you know, with some of the junior football that isn't really that well known. We have a great running back in Winnipeg who came out of that league and proved that there is the ability for greatness to come out of there. What other things can we do? I understand, you know, if I'm understanding you correctly, an appreciation for the sport from the community's perspective to help raise the appreciation and the understanding that what an athlete is doing is important, because I'm a firm believer that athletes need to be challenged not only on the field, they need to be challenged off the field as well, in regards to, you know, people challenging them to suggest you're not the best player, this guy's the best player. In other words, the knowledge of the community can assist in doing what you're suggesting.
Well, sometimes it's a matter of support from the community as well, and recognizing that you may have a special talent there that may not have, whether it's financial support, whether it's mentorship, you know, those sorts of things that are things that I think can come from the community a lot. Resources show up in so many different ways. Right? Not everybody is necessarily in a position to help with money. Not everybody is in a position to help with time. But you know, it may be that you have a facility of some kind that may be of value and may be able to help someone along. And so I just think that there are so many different ways that if people want to get involved, if people want to help out, if people want to try and support, again, not just the game of football. Obviously, football is something that is very dear to the three of us. But you know, I think when you talk about what the values of sports in general in terms of raising young people in a community, you know, the support of that community in so many different ways play such a huge role. And whether those kids end up playing sports at a higher level or not, as we talked about earlier, I think that there's so many others through sports that should in so many other ways.
David?
I think another one too is just the visibility of the sport as well. I mean, we haven't had CFL football played in a calendar year. We're pushing towards it, but there's still the talks that it's not 100% confirmed. Do you feel like that also impacts, you know, the way the sport's viewed in this country, and that at the professional level, we're not able to see it. We're not able to. I know going to a game is a challenge of its own, but even just seeing the sport has been a challenge right now.
Yeah, I think obviously it's tough sometimes to remain relevant, right? When you look around and other leagues and the CFL isn't. You know, I'm a big believer, quite honestly, that it was the right decision not to play last year. But you know, there will obviously be a push in 2021 to get back on the field, and I believe that's something that's going to happen. And you know, hopefully we have a little bit of a case where, provided everything is safe, that absence has made the heart grow a little bit fonder of the Canadian Football League, and maybe some of the people who didn't think they'd miss it that much will realize that you know, they've missed it more than they ever thought they would.
Let's talk about young players coming up. Look back 20 years and just give us an understanding of the progression of, you know, the positional players, you know, where players play, how it's changed over the past 20 years.
Yeah, well, I think it goes along with the quarterback conversation, but also you alluded to a running back in Andrew Harris and many others. I think that when you look historically, one of the things I look at just as an example is sort of percentage wise of the Canadian kids who are playing at Division I schools in the States, and it's reflected in the Canadian Football League by the way that the ratio historically has sort of been deployed by teams where the majority of Canadians are offensive linemen. And I think you've seen the same thing historically in terms of Canadians playing in Division I football, if we want to call that the highest level of college football in North America. That it used to be 20 years ago that you would see a disproportionate number of those guys would be linemen, primarily offensive linemen, but some defensive linemen, typically guys who were recruited because of their size. The one thing you can't teach, and the feeling that they'd get down there and be coached and be taught. And I think that now, as you see the years go by, you're seeing more and more players at every position, more Canadian players at every position who are playing at that level, are being recognized as good as the American recruits at that level. And, I think it contributes and filters to the Canadian university football as well, that players at every position are more skilled than they were not just 20 years ago, than they were 10 years ago. And I would even argue than they were 5 years ago, because it's something that is literally constantly evolving and constantly improving, that you're getting to a point where, you have great Canadian players at literally every position. I know we talked about it a lot leading up to the 2020 draft as to how unique it was to have a draft class in which really the strongest position group was defensive back, because that is historically the position at which Canadians are used the least in the Canadian Football League, are, sort of relative to the number of guys. Obviously, every Canadian university team playing 5 defensive backs, but most CFL teams not playing more than one. Many CFL teams playing no Canadian defensive backs within the way that they use the ratio. But yet, we see a draft in which, you had 5 or 6 outstanding prospects who were defensive backs, a couple of them so good that they were picked within the first few rounds of the National Football League draft. And so that's what you're seeing in terms of the evolution of the game, is that you're seeing great Canadian skill players, not just great Canadian linemen.
David?
No, I would actually agree. I wanted to bring that point up as well, is that, for the longest time, especially with the CFL draft, it was always, all right, which lineman is going to go first overall, or whether it's on offense or defense. But, I think it speaks differently when you see a receiver go within the first, 3 picks, or you see, as you said, a defensive back, someone whose name gets called a little bit more in the game. And I think it really speaks, it adds a little more importance to that Canadians can play those skilled positions, are not just asked to be the supporting cast in some cases. And it's not the worst thing to be a supporting player, because they're as you mentioned earlier, every player plays their part on the field. But to, especially this past season, to see a guy like Chase Claypool get his name called, and that brought up a lot of Canadian pride even for those up here. And do you feel like we're now getting to the point where we're going to see a healthy dose of players in those skill positions really take the lead?
Yeah, I really do. I think it's one of the things that is probably going to have to evolve a little bit in the CFL, is just the way that teams deploy the ratio, where I think that you should see teams start to get away a little bit from being too slotted in terms of what positions are going to be Canadian positions, so to speak. And, again, we talked about this a little bit leading up to the draft, but just the idea of evolving to the point where we are more drafting the best players and making sure that our 7 best Canadians are on the field at any given time, regardless of their position, and recognizing that we're getting to a point where there is becoming enough depth at every position. It's not just depth at the line positions, whether interior offensive linemen, interior defensive linemen, You know, you sort of get your one wide side wide out. You maybe get the occasional Canadian slot and those sorts of things, is not getting so stuck in terms of positions, as I said, but where you have great players at every position, let's make sure that the great players are getting on the field up here.
Well, we only got a couple of minutes left, so let me start a tire fire. We we have some people who are suggesting on that note. We've got a whole 5 minutes left in the show, so I don't know if we have enough time for this question. Where some people are suggesting we don't need to have Canadian players. What do you say to that?
Only 5 minutes, you say?
I'm just trying to give you an out. You know, that's why I asked it now, because I didn't want to set
the shorter part of the answer. And this is something that we talked about earlier. I do think that the part of the marketability of the Canadian Football League in Canada is the relatability between players and fans, of having Canadian players who played at high schools and universities that are familiar to the fans, that with which fans have a frame of reference and can associate with, and take a certain sense of ownership in, whether the player is playing for his hometown team or not. You know, you may be watching a guy who's from your hometown or from your school, or a school that you played against, or whatever it was, playing somewhere in the CFL. And I think it makes you, it gives you a sense of ownership in the league. You know, gives you a vested interest, a rooting interest as a fan. But I also think, aside from that, I think that the Canadian Football League has a bit of a responsibility, quite frankly, to lower levels of football in this country, to university football, to junior football, even to high school football, of giving those young people to aspire to, giving them a league to play in. Yeah, some Canadians are going to have the opportunity to play in the National Football League. That's what their skill set is going to suggest that they are able to do, they are suited to do, and so on. But you know, I think that the Canadian Football League needs to have a place for the Canadian player. And, you know, I mean, especially right now, as we talked about, with every few years, I'll even generously call it with every decade. And I can say this as a guy who has been involved in this league very closely over a number of decades. With every decade, the quality of players being produced in this country improves dramatically. And I think it would be an absolute travesty, as the talent being produced in Canada is the best it has ever been, for there to not be a place for a majority of those players to play, I think would be just a shame.
There's an inextricable symbiosis between Canadians and the game of football. And if we don't have Canadian players, we cut that off. I argue this point with so many people who think that being the second best American Football League would make us more popular than the Canadian Football League. I'm not even, and again, we only have about a minute left. There's lots of other things that I'd love to discuss with you, like, do the rules really matter, or does the game matter more? You got only a few seconds.
Matter.
You get what I'm saying? Like, what's more important, the rules or the game and the fans and how they interact with the game in Canada? You got about 30 seconds. Can you handle it?
Well, I don't know if there's a short answer to this, but I will say that, listen, other than the National Football League, you look historically, no other league playing American rules has had staying power. Exactly. No league in the United States, no league other than the NFL has survived, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. The only league in North America that has had staying power alongside the NFL, however you want to look at it, is the Canadian Football League, with the history we have. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's different and has a different identity. And in terms of play, the elements of play of Canadian football, there's a reason why the National Football League is stealing a lot of those elements of play that originated up here. So look at it.
Because it's a great game.
Amen.
That it is.
Mr. Ford, thank you for taking this time. It's an hour that went by very quickly, and I wanted to make sure we talked about minor sports. We did that, minor football. we did that. Maybe someday we'll have you back, and we'll drag the soapbox in and see what you can do with that.
All right. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Ford.
My
For David
pleasure.
Morassutti and Dwayne Ford, my name is Candid Frank Stanisci. Thank you for watching CFL Talk, seen live Mondays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This show can also be heard on the Spanglish World Radio Network. For CFL Talk news, entertainment, and other sports programming we offer, please check out Spanglish World. Spanglish World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, and live it. Thank you for watching, everybody. Until next time.